I know this sounds strange, maybe even ridiculous to some of you, but I'm desperate for an answer, so bear with me. Has anyone here, at any point in their lives, ever dreamed of something or someone called the Inside Out Man? If that name triggers anything, even a faint sense of déjà vu, I need to know. For years, I thought the nightmares I had as a kid were just that, nightmares. My mind's way of twisting childhood fears into something grotesque, something awful, something somewhat tangible. But every fall, when Halloween passes and the air grows colder, he slips back into my mind. I thought I was the only one who remembered him for a while. He was only around for a few weeks in the fall, nearly 2 decades ago, and my inner rationality kept reassuring me that I had made him up, since no one ever spoke about him after middle school. But that got crushed a few days ago when my friend from 7th grade, Melissa, reached out to me. Her message was short, just a single line. "Do you still think about him?" She didn't need to say who. November is here, it's his month. So, because of that, I have to ask, has anyone ever dreamed about the Inside Out Man? Everything started back in 2005. I was in 7th grade and it was moving into the late fall season, November 1st. I walked into school that day to find something off about the place. It was subtle at first, an undercurrent that rippled through the halls. I noticed it in the eyes of my classmates, a strange look of exhaustion I hadn't seen before, as if they hadn't slept. Their faces were pale, their movements were slow, lethargic, and heavy. And there was something else too. Fear. In our homeroom, I sat next to Melissa. Usually she'd be chatting up a storm about her costume, her plans for next year's Halloween season, and the extent of her candy haul. But that morning, she was silent, her hands folded on her desk, her eyes fixed on the floor. When I nudged her, she flinched, and I saw that her knuckles were bone white. They were clenched so tightly her hands shook. "Hey," I whispered, leaning over towards her. "Are you all right?" Melissa didn't look at me. She just nodded vaguely in an empty motion. Her gaze was distant, somewhere else, as though she was watching something play out behind her eyes. I could tell that the words she needed to say were hidden just past her lips, but her teeth were clenched so hard her jaw wouldn't let her speak. By lunchtime, I started noticing it wasn't just Melissa and a few others. The broken kids were everywhere. The same kids who had come in laughing the day before, vibrant and excited, were slumped against their seats, staring blankly at their food, flinching at sudden sounds. A handful of them looked like they'd been crying. I remember feeling awkward. I was just a kid like them. So even though I knew something was wrong, I just didn't know what to do. Eventually, when the lunch bell rang, I made the choice to pull Melissa aside. She didn't resist, just followed me wordlessly deeper into the hallway. I looked at her face, really looked at it. There was this shimmer in her eyes, a certain wetness. I asked her again if she was okay, but this time, I pressed harder. I didn't let her shake it off. After a long, tense silence, she spoke, her voice so soft it almost came out as just an exhale. "You ever have a dream that doesn't feel like a dream?" she asked, her eyes finally meeting mine. Her pupils were huge, swallowing the color of her irises. She looked like a wounded deer about to give up on life. "Yeah," I said, though I wasn't sure I really understood, but I still wanted to know. The more I looked at her, the more I sensed that whatever she was about to tell me was something that I didn't want to hear, or maybe something I shouldn't hear. It wasn't just a nightmare," she said, her voice trembling. "He was there, in my room, and I know it was a dream, but it was like he was real." "Who was?" She swallowed hard, and in a voice barely above a murmur, she said, "The Inside Out Man." The name sent a jolt of nervousness through me, though I didn't know why. I had no memory of anything like it, yet it felt familiar, as if something deep within me had always known that name. I asked her who he was, and her eyes went unfocused, as though she were slipping back into her dreams. It was the same look she had at her desk a few hours earlier. He crawls," she whispered. "He drags himself into the room, all wet and wrong, like he's inside out. You can see everything, the muscles, the bones moving under them, his veins. There's no skin, just rawness. She hugged herself tightly, shivering. And he moves like he doesn't have bones, or he can take them out if he wants. I saw him crawl through the crack under my door, just squeeze himself in. She paused, her breath coming in shallow gasps. I wanted to tell her to stop, to say it was just a dream, but something inside me kept me quiet. I needed to hear it all. I needed to know what she had seen. His tongue is the worst, she said finally. It's long, too long. It comes out of his mouth like a rope. It's wet and thick, like it could wrap around you 100 times, and he uses it to reach you, to pull you toward him. I watched her relive it, watched her arms wrap around her torso as though trying to shield herself from the memory. Her face had gone pale, her breathing shallow, and as much as I wanted to look away, I couldn't. I was frozen, captivated by the horror of it. He likes it when you're scared, she continued. He just watches you squirm. Last night he crawled under my bed. I could feel him just inches away. His tongue wrapped around my leg, and he pulled, but I woke up. The last words left her lips in a broken whisper, and she began to cry, silent tears sliding down her cheeks. I felt paralyzed, unable to comfort her, unable to make any of this make sense. "It's okay, Melissa. It was just a bad dream," I said to her. "No, it wasn't, Alex. My ankle was wet when I woke up. I know he was there." I didn't know what else to say. I kept her company for the rest of the school day and eventually went back home. But something was off that night. I laid in bed, eyes glued to the dark ceiling, replaying Melissa's story over and over in my head. Her story had lodged itself somewhere deep in my mind, like a splinter that wouldn't come out. I kept gazing at my bedroom door. The inside-out man had crawled into her room by pulling himself through that tiny little crack under her door. It was a visual I kept replaying in my head. It paired well with the memory of her face when she told me about it. I had never seen her that terrified before. Her eyes were huge and panicked, like she was staring at something only she could see. And now, lying in the dark, I couldn't shake the feeling that she'd handed me some sort of invitation, that by hearing her story, I'd be able to see the monsters too. Eventually, the exhaustion of the day had finally pulled me under. I was only 12 after all. I couldn't hang on forever. Eventually, I had to slip into sleep. When I opened my eyes, I was no longer laying down on my bed. I was laying down on the floor of somewhere else, a place that felt twisted, wrong, familiar yet distorted in every way. The walls around me reminded me of my grandma's house. They were eggshell white with high ceilings. They seemed to breathe. All four walls expanded and contracted just enough to be noticeable, like the whole room was alive. It was then that I noticed the shadows strewn about from old furniture that had clung to the corners of the room. The shadows were thick and sticky, as if they'd been painted on with tar. The air had a sour, metallic stench that filled my nostrils. It was sickly sweet and dense like rotting meat. I covered my mouth, trying not to gag, but the smell only grew stronger, coating my tongue, clinging to my throat. I tried to sit up, but my body felt heavy, as if invisible hands were pressing down on my legs and chest. I struggled, trying to stand, to get my bearings, but the only things I could move were my arms and my head. I felt my heart begin to quicken as a certain awful feeling began to come over me. That was when I heard it, the wet, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across a damp floor. It came from somewhere behind me, slow and deliberate, and with each sickening scrape, I felt my already throbbing pulse quicken. I didn't want to turn around. Every instinct screamed at me to stay still, to pretend I didn't hear it, to make myself small and invisible. But slowly, against my better judgment, I craned my neck towards the noise. At first, I thought the shape was just a shadow, something my mind had conjured up in the dim light of the room. But as my eyes adjusted, I began to piece the shape together. It was crouched low, its body sprawled across the floor like it was prostrating. The skinless form glistened in the faint light. Muscles and tendons were exposed, raw and pulsating, veins throbbing in sync with some horrible, unnatural heartbeat. Its bones jutted out at odd angles, as if his joints had been twisted and broken, and it was dragging itself toward me on limbs that should have been rendered useless. He was smiling, or at least I think he was trying to. His mouth stretched too wide, his lips non-existent, just bare teeth and gums glistening with saliva. And then, as he crawled closer, I saw his tongue. It unfurled like some grotesque living snake, slick and pink, stretching out from his mouth and trailing along the floor. It slithered forward, almost reaching me, before quickly retracting back into his mouth with a wet slap. He then chattered his teeth, as if tasting the air between us. But he didn't stop crawling closer as his face chattered. In fact, he moved faster, each movement accompanied by a wet, slurping sound as his body slid across the floor. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body was still glued to the floor. All I could do was watch, every fiber of my being focused on that raw, wriggling form. I looked more closely at his face. Its eyes were empty sockets, two hollow black pits that seemed to drink in the light.
"Hello?"
He rasped, his voice a low, guttural whisper like wind through cracked glass.
"Do you want to play?"
The words sent a shiver down my spine. His voice didn't sound human. It was twisted, layered, as though 100 different voices were speaking at once. He was close now, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating off his body. I could smell the sickly, rotten stench of his raw flesh. His tongue slithered out again, curling along the floor like a serpent, inching toward my feet.
"Are you scared?"
He whispered, his voice dripping with mock sympathy.
"I just want a taste."
He stretched one hand out toward me, his fingers unnaturally long, the bones visible beneath torn muscle. They wrapped around my ankle, cold and sticky, sending a jolt of ice-cold tension up my spine. His grip was like iron, unbreakable, and he started to pull, dragging me toward him inch by inch. My adrenaline kicked in. My legs found freedom. I kicked and thrashed, but it was no use. His grip tightened, and he laughed, a wet, choking sound that made my stomach twist. The closer he pulled me, the louder his breathing became, each exhale ragged and damp, like he was savoring every second of my fear.
"You have to run away to play,"
he said, his face inches from mine now. His eyes were black pits, bottomless and hungry. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block him out, to pretend this was all a dream, that I could will him away. But then I felt it, his tongue, wet and hot, wrapping around my leg. It was thick and muscular, coiling around me like a thick serpent, squeezing tighter and tighter. The sensation was so vivid, so horribly real, that I couldn't tell myself that it was just a nightmare. I could feel his saliva seeping into my skin, feel the rough, slimy texture of his tongue as it crept up me. I opened my eyes after I realized I couldn't will myself awake. I looked down, watching as his tongue slithered higher, wrapping around my torso, constricting me in a crushing, wet embrace. My breaths came in short, panicked gasps, each one sharper than the last. I could feel his tongue strangling me, squeezing the air from my lungs.
"Fight it,"
he moaned, his voice a caress, almost soothing.
"It's better if you fight."
His jaw unhinged, opening wider than any human mouth should, stretching and cracking as his head tilted back, preparing to swallow me whole. I saw rows of jagged teeth, gleaming and wet, waiting to clamp down. His tongue pulled me closer, drawing me toward that dark, gaping maw, toward the endless blackness inside him. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. My voice was trapped somewhere deep inside, swallowed by the terror that had consumed me. His mouth closed in, inch by inch, until I could feel his breath on my face, hot and rancid. And then I woke up. I was in my bed, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst. My sheets were twisted around my legs, damp and tangled, and my throat was raw, As if I'd been screaming, I sat up, gasping for breath, clutching my chest as I tried to convince myself it was just a nightmare. That Melissa's story had just conjured up something awful in my mind. But when I looked down, I saw it. A faint smear of something wet on my ankle, like a handprint left behind. I didn't sleep well the next night, or the night after that, because now I knew, in that dark, twisted part of my imagination, that he was out there, and he was going to come back. And he did. In every dream I had, he was there, always in the background lurking. He was in every nook and cranny and behind every corner. I began to become afraid of things as simple as desk drawers, because somehow, someway, he'd contort his body to fit into any space, no matter how small. Eventually, I stopped sleeping. We all did. And as November continued, our sleepless states began to take its toll on us. Children would end up falling asleep mid-class and wake up in fits. But the worst of it started coming about when we began to fall asleep with our eyes open. To be honest, I don't know how long I went without sleeping. Not really. It all blurred together, the nights and days. I'd lay there in my bed, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling and listening to every creak and groan of the house settling, every whisper of wind outside. I knew, somewhere deep down, that if I let myself slip, even for a moment, he'd be there waiting, crawling out from the smallest cracks. By the time the third week of November rolled around, I wasn't even trying to function like normal. I was a ghost of myself, dragging through school with the same vacant, hollow-eyed stare I'd seen in my friends. It was around that time that the kids began dropping off, disappearing from school for days at a time, and when they came back, they were different. It felt like whatever it was that had made them kids was gone, like that little light was taken away. The ones who still managed to show up every day looked just as terrible as I did. Dark circles smudged under our eyes like bruises, puffy and swollen. None of us said anything, not even to each other after a while. What could we say? Even if we wanted to talk about our nightmares, we could barely hold on to a thought for more than a few seconds. It was at the beginning of the third week that things escalated for me. I was waiting for the bus to take me home after school. My body was slumped on the curb of the parking lot, eyes barely open, but I could still see the stretch of cars ahead of me. They were parked close together, forming narrow black pools underneath them, a grid of dark patches, like voids creeping along the pavement. My eyelids drooped, fighting gravity, and I could feel myself slipping, my head lolling forward. The fight I'd been putting up for days now was finally ending, whether I wanted it to or not. My eyes never closed, but my mind slipped away. The sounds of the other kids faded, and I was left in silence, paralyzed in a state of being half lucid, half asleep. It was at this point I saw the parking lot in front of me start to slowly lose its form. It became twisted, distorted, like the air had been sucked out of it, leaving the world stretched and elongated in strange, impossible ways. The cars, normally a mishmash of different colors, became monotone gray silhouettes, slick and oozing in the faint overcast light from above. It was around that time when I saw something dart out from under one car's undercarriage to another. At first, I could only see the slick glimmer of something wet and dark slithering along the ground, like oil shimmering in the light. But as my eyes focused, I saw him fully, that twisted body bending, cracking, limbs folding unnaturally into themselves as the thing slid along the pavement at unnatural speeds. It weaved his way from one crevice to the next. His bones seemed to shift and dislocate with each rapid movement. The sickening pop of joints echoed faintly through the lot. His body squeezed into each narrow space without effort. His limbs stretched too long, his fingers scrabbling over the pavement as he dragged himself forward, closer and closer, from under one car to the next. He looked like a man-sized spider scurrying down the lot. My breath caught and I held perfectly still, hoping that if I didn't move, he wouldn't see me. But it didn't matter. He already knew I was there. He was playing with me. I didn't see him for a prolonged period of false security. I tried to take this time to stir from my slumber and re-enter the real world, but I just couldn't. I saw him slide his face out from under the car nearest me, his head craning unnaturally to peer out, those empty dark sockets locking onto me from across the pavement. I felt like a trapped animal, my pulse thundering in my chest, my limbs frozen to the spot. I couldn't scream, couldn't look away, as he slowly dragged himself out from under the car, inch by inch, his grin stretching too wide, too eager. I couldn't blink, couldn't even take a breath. His tongue slithered out of his mouth, moist and glistening, stretching down across the pavement like a slick rope, inching toward me. I could see his muscles flexing, his joints twisting as he dragged himself forward, his fingers curling against the ground as though savoring each movement. Every inch he crawled felt like an eternity, every second drawing him closer to me.
Found you.
He rasped, his voice sliding over the air like a caress, sickly candied and pleasing.
Why don't you come and play with me?
His slick flesh left a wet trail behind him. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. Every part of me was locked in place, my body betraying me as he crept closer and closer. Then he did something he had never done before. He stood up like a man and lost his smile. Just as he began to walk towards me, I heard the low rumble of an engine in the distance, a sound so ordinary, so human, that it jolted me back to reality. My school bus. I saw it turning into the lot, headlights sweeping across the cars, illuminating the dark shadows with a harsh yellow light. I turned back towards the thing in front of me. I expected him to be gone, to be returned to my real existence. But he was still there, his face contorted in a snarl, teeth gleaming wetly in the light of the school bus. He skittered back under the car he came from like an insect, his limbs folding in every direction as he pulled himself into the undercarriage, vanishing from sight. But even then, I knew he wasn't gone. I could feel him, lurking just beyond the edge of the metal, watching, waiting. The bus pulled up in front of me, and the doors squeaked open, the driver giving me a strange look. I didn't even think. I jumped up, my legs shaky and weak, and stumbled onto the bus. I collapsed into the first empty seat, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it would break through my ribs. As the bus pulled away, I looked out the window, my eyes scanning the lot, half expecting to see him darting after us, his twisted, skinless form scrambling across the pavement. But there was nothing. Just the empty, quiet parking lot, the shadows stretching long and dark under the cars. I slumped back in my seat, trying to catch my breath, to convince myself it was just another sleep-deprived vision. But I knew things had just changed. When the bus dropped me off, I could barely drag myself down the driveway. My legs felt weak, my mind buzzing, replaying what I had just seen. I stumbled up the steps to the front door, fumbling with my keys, half expecting to see his face leering out from behind the bushes or peering through the windows. But everything was quiet, just the last light of the dusk creeping through the sky. Inside, the house was dark and empty, eerily silent. My parents wouldn't be back for a few hours, but something about the quiet felt wrong. I tried to shake it off, dropping my bag by the door and heading to the kitchen, hoping to lose myself in something normal, something solid. But every creak of the floorboards, every tick of the clock, felt amplified, like the house was holding its breath. I poured a glass of water, hands shaking, eyes darting around the room. I tried to remind myself it was over. He couldn't be here, in my home. He was part of a nightmare, something that belonged in imaginations, not here in the warmth of my kitchen. But as I took a sip, my heart stammered to a stop. There, near the base of the pantry door, was a dark, wet trail smeared across the floor, leading out from the drawer. I froze, the glass slipping from my hand and shattering on the tiles. The noise echoed through the house, and then the silence returned. Slowly, I followed the trail with my eyes, my breath hitching, every instinct screaming at me to turn around, to run, to leave. But my eyes continued forward, following the slick smear as it led toward the hallway.
Didn't you miss me?
The voice was soft, almost tender, but still deformed, still layered in a dozen different voices. My pulse thundered in my ears, and I could feel my chest tightening, my limbs freezing, as that familiar wet slithering sound echoed through the silence. I forced myself to turn toward the voice, dread curling tight in my gut. There, crouched in the hallway, half hidden by the shade of the walls, was the skinless man. His body angled unnaturally, limbs twisted in ways that made my own skin crawl, every muscle and tendon of his fully exposed, gleaming in what little light got to him. He grinned, his familiar mouth stretching too wide, exposing every detail of every tooth. I had fun. I couldn't reply, I couldn't even breathe. My body was locked in place, my mind screaming at me to run, to get out, but I was paralyzed, trapped in his hollow-eyed stare. This time I knew I hadn't fallen asleep. He moved, slinking forward, his joints creaking, bones cracking as he dragged himself toward me, his tongue slithering out to brush against the floor, tasting the air. I staggered back, finally finding control of my legs, and turned to run, my heart hammering as I bolted down the hallway, tearing toward the back door. But he was just as fast. I heard him behind me, a wet slapping sound as he pulled himself along, each movement disturbingly agile, disturbingly smooth. I burst through the back door, stumbling down the steps and into the field behind my house, the grass wet and slick beneath my feet. I didn't dare look back. I just ran, the cold air biting at my skin, my lungs burning with every breath. But I could feel him. He was there, in the blurred edges of my vision, slipping through the tall grass, his body bending, contorting, shifting to match my every step. I pushed myself harder, my legs aching, my vision fogging as I tore through the field. But it was useless. He was gaining on me, closing the distance with flitted and broken movements. Just as I neared the far edge of the field, I felt something hot and wet coil around my ankle, yanking me off my feet. I hit the ground hard, the breath knocked from my lungs, and before I could even begin to struggle, he was there, looming over me, his face inches from mine.
Why run?
He whispered, his voice soft and condescending. His tongue snaked out again, brushing against my cheek, leaving a trail of saliva that burned like acid.
Playtime's over.
He opened his mouth wider, his jaw unhinging, stretching impossibly wide until it was a gaping black maw, rows of sharp, gleaming teeth waiting to swallow me whole. I tried to scream, but his tongue coiled around my throat, squeezing tight, choking off my voice as he dragged me closer, pulling me toward the endless darkness inside him. His mouth closed around me, hot and suffocating, his teeth scraping against my skin as he swallowed me whole, the walls of his throat closing in, hot and wet and pulsing, pulling me deeper and deeper into the darkness. I felt the tearing of his teeth, the meaty texture of his cheeks. My body was whole, but it was broken. And then there was nothing, and I don't know when I woke up, only that it was morning, sunlight streaming through the window, the warmth unfamiliar, almost foreign against my skin. I sat up slowly, my body aching, my throat raw, and for a moment, I just sat there, staring at the wall, trying to remember what had happened. The memories felt hazy, distant, like the fading edges of a nightmare I couldn't quite grasp. But as I sat there, a strange, tingling sensation spread through my stomach, hot and prickling, like something was crawling beneath my skin. I pressed a hand to my abdomen, but the feeling only grew stronger, creeping upward, filling me with a hollow, gnawing ache. I stumbled out of bed, my legs shaky, barely able to hold me up as I made my way to the bathroom. I splashed cold water on my face, trying to wash away the feeling, but it lingered, a constant, burning reminder just beneath the surface. And then as I looked at my reflection in the mirror, I realized what it was, that feeling, that emptiness gnawing at me from within. It was like a piece of me was gone, something vital, something I couldn't name, but that I knew, deep down, I would never get back. That was the last time I ever saw him. But every year, when November comes around, when the air grows colder and the days grow shorter, I can feel him, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting, like the shadow of a memory I can never quite shake. And sometimes, in the dead of night, I'll wake up with that same hot, prickling sensation in my stomach, like he's still there, buried deep inside me, a part of me that I can never escape.